Well, thank you very much, Professor Roberts, for being here.
My pleasure.
Gracias por la rendición de cuentas. Thank you very much. First question, could you summarize those ideas that you said in your conference about the two new or current challenges about new forms of official resistance to transparency and the role of, the information technology in which we are just living now?
Yeah. Well, the good news over the last 20 years is that we have built a very powerful global community of people who care about transparency. And then the current challenge is that we have these two problems before us. The first is that political elites, important decision makers, are more skeptical about transparency than they were, let's say, 20 years ago. Because of a succession of crises and problems, they are less open to the concept of transparency than they were in the big push for democratization in the late 1990s. That is one problem. And then the other challenge is that information technology is changing quite radically. And that means that governments are collecting more information and they're handling information in different ways than they used to. We used to live in a world of paper documents in folders and filing cabinets. We don't live in that kind of world anymore. And that means it's more difficult for citizens to know how to extract information and how to make sense of it when they do get it.
All right. So could you elaborate a little bit about these new forms of resistance? So just tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, dozens and dozens of countries adopted laws recognizing a right to information between, let's say, 1990 and about 2010, including Mexico. And that was because at that time there was great enthusiasm about democracy, because you had the collapse of the Soviet Union and the collapse of authoritarian regimes elsewhere. And the idea was, well, how can democracy be meaningful unless you have access to information? And that was the mood of the time. The mood today is a little darker. Some countries are worried about national security more than they used to be. Some countries are worried about internal law and order more than they used to be. Many countries are worried about managing economic crises. And the attitude today tends to be that in times like this, transparency is a luxury. Mm-hmm. It's something we can't afford because government has to get on with the job of restoring order or protecting the country or managing the economy.
Acts or whatever.
That's right. So that's the sort of argument that we have to resist, the notion that we're in different times and that therefore all of these transparency rules we adopted a few years ago don't need to be taken as seriously mm-hmm. today.
You said something very important in my view, which is, you said the power, among people in government are in less and less people, few people
yeah.
taking very big and important decisions, and that also runs against transparency.
That's right. And so in the context of economic globalization, I think that in many countries what you've seen is that governmental power has shifted to a smaller number of players. Mm-hmm. Powerful leaders of government, powerful finance ministries, powerful central banks.
Very powerful in many times, in many cases, no?
That's right. Mm-hmm. And the argument is, well, you know, the global economy is a turbulent, dangerous place. Mm-hmm. You have to have strong leadership. But the problem is that any time you concentrate power in that way, you run into problems of accountability. If power is more diffused and you have centers of power fighting or contesting with each other, you generally tend to have more openness. Mm.
Is there any possibility to fight against that trend?
Well, I think this is a matter of mobilization by people who care about transparency. Mm-hmm. This is above all a problem of politics, mm-hmm. that people who care about transparency, and that could be non-governmental organizations, it could mm-hmm. be citizens, it could be journalists, it could be parts of government whose job is to worry about openness. They have to build a coalition that makes governments honor the idea of transparency. Mm-hmm. The good news is that over the last 20 years, we have got governments in the habit of talking about openness. They know they have to use the language of openness. Mm-hmm. So now the challenge is to get them to take it seriously.
Exactly, because it's politically correct to say
That's
about
right.
something about openness. But talking about that, is among people in government, is clear the difference between transparency and accountability? It's my question. Do
Yeah.
you think that it is clear, the difference, or the...
I don't know if it is. You know, when we talk about transparency and accountability, I often find it helpful to talk about what specific context we mean. But my own view is that accountability is meaningless if you don't have transparency, if you don't have access to information. How can you hold a public body or a political leader or a bureaucrat to account for their performance if you don't have access to information about what they have done and how they have done it?
I see. Let's talk about a little bit about the other challenge of technology,
Right.
and information.
Yeah.
Please.
Well, certainly. At the time that freedom of information laws first came into play, we lived in a paper world where records were kept in memoranda and reports.
By the way, it was great, the file of John Lennon.
Oh, thank you.
That's great.
Yeah. And so, you know, and this was a relatively simple world. By today's standards, not that much information, very easy to access, very easy for an average citizen to understand the document when they get it. But that world is disappearing, and we live in a world of digitized information, information that could be held in many different forms, and much, much more information than was available previously. And so it's not just a question of access to the information. It's not a question of whether I have a right to get information. It's a question of whether I would understand this massive information when I got it, whether I would have the technical knowledge or the equipment to interpret the information that government is holding. Because, you know, it's a mass of digitized, computerized information.
I see. In this global world in which we live now, you said something very interesting about the governments are privatizing
Yes.
many areas of government.
Yeah.
Rails, roads, schools, hospitals, etc. So what's the role, what should be the role of private sector in terms of transparency and accountability, given the fact that they are getting more and more and more areas of economic areas that used to be part of government?
Yeah. So we have this phenomenon of privatization that is particularly acute in the area of infrastructure, as you say, roads, utilities, schools, hospitals, all of the things we need in order to make a society work well. We're in a period of a global infrastructure boom because roughly 1 billion people over this span of a few decades are moving from rural areas to cities. So we're in this massive global project of city building, and that will be done increasingly by private actors, by private companies, sometimes working under contract for governments. And so the challenge is making sure, especially in this domain, but with regard to any aspect of privatization, do we have adequate information about the contractual arrangements between governments and the contractors? Do we have adequate information, access to information held by the contractors about the actual work they're doing? These are not contracts like a contract of a few years ago that might go for a year or so. Some of these contracts are massive and they go for decades. They're very different and much more complicated exercises, and that will create challenges of transparency and accountability. How do you hold those actors accountable for their performance?
That's when they say transparency is a luxury.
Yeah, that's right.
Let us work. Well, finally, Professor Roberts, what's your opinion on the absence of sanctions against people in government who are not giving or delivering information correctly?
A credible law, my specialty is freedom of information law. So with regard to that, a credible law has to be one that has appropriate sanctions for organizations that are not respecting what the law requires. Sanctions are necessary to take the law seriously, but I think the one thing I would say is that an effective enforcement strategy is not going to depend only or even primarily on sanctions.
Mm-hmm.
Sanctions are something that are always there, available in the back, but I think enforcement is going to mean talking to agencies.
Mm-hmm.
Very often the problem of non-compliance isn't a bad will, it's just that an organization hasn't invested in the systems that are necessary to make transparency work. So very often it's working with institutions to make them realize what they need to do to honor the law. And sanctions have to be there in the background as plan B, as they would say.
All right, just in case.
Just in case, that's right.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Roberts, for your time, and enjoy.
My pleasure, and thank you very much for the
in
opportunity
Mexico.
to visit.
Thank you.